I didn't hear that introduction, but thank you very much. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. This is a big moment for me. I always wanted to write a book about music, and when I went to Prague almost 20 years ago, no, more than 20 years ago, and I walked around the streets of Prague and across the bridges, and music was everywhere in that town. There's a saying, and a Czech saying, that one Czech, one musician. And it's totally true. You can't walk across the Charles Bridge, which is on the cover of this beautiful job that Grove did, without hearing, Grove. Without hearing, I don't know, accordions and out-of-tune guitar is strummed by hippies singing folk songs, and all this, anything you think, jazz clubs. Now I found my place. This is perfect. And I wanted to write about a piano sonata for some reason. And so I thought, well, here we go. And I started working on the book. The book, briefly, I'll just read you a little bit of it so I can have a conversation with the wonderful Diane Ackerman. The book starts in 1939 when the Nazis invade Prague and occupy Prague. And when they came in, they were, as most of you know, they were confiscating everything of value, anything that had of art, cultural value, including musical manuscripts if they happened to find anything. And Ottilie Bartoshova, who is one of the two main female protagonists in the book, had inherited a manuscript from her father. It was a very troubling manuscript to her for a host of reasons. But she decided to break it up. It's a sonata in 3 parts, unattributed manuscript, 18th century, into 3 parts. She gave one to her husband, one to her best friend, kept one herself, figuring that after the war they'd all get back together again and be reunited themselves and then reunite the manuscript too, but they never saw each other again, ever. So fast forward to the year 2000, and there's a young musicologist who lives over in the East Village named Meta Taverner, who's our other principal character. And Meta gets a phone call from her best friend who says, she's a hospice nurse, and she said, one of my patients is dying, and she heard you play piano at a little recital, and she's obsessed with you, and she has something she needs to show you. And it turns out to be the middle section of the sonata, which is up on Kalmia Avenue in deepest, darkest Queens, of all places. But Irina, who is the best friend, she emigrated to the States during the war. And so Meta sees the manuscript, and she is galvanized, and she sets out to put together the rest of the sonata. But let me backtrack to 39 so you can hear a little bit of the book. When the Germans are marching into Prague. Several hours had passed since the first troops made their appearance. Jakub would surely have left the shop in Josefov by now. The Antiqua was small, just a narrow cavern with high, ornate ceilings, its facade a door and display window. Ottilie had to believe he'd finished hiding the valuables, shut off the lights, closed and locked up. This meant he was either delayed by the growing crowds of townspeople and Nazis flooding the squares and streets, or that he had been detained. Without further thought, she pulled out a suitcase from the back of their bedroom closet and began to pack. Some shirts of his, underclothing, a pair of flannel trousers, and a jacket. His favorite cravat, the black silk one he wore to graduation exercises at engineering school, before he left that trade for the shop inherited from his father. For herself, she folded a few dresses, a sweater, toiletries, a pair of lace gloves her mother had passed down to her. Lace gloves, she reflected, wincing, and set them aside. The silly things we cherish. She also packed the photograph of her parents. Her chest was heaving, although no tears filled her eyes. The room reeled as she tried to catch her breath. With effort, she got the overstuffed suitcase closed and buckled its leather straps in place. Then there was the matter of the manuscript, a piano sonata in 3 movements, its staves scored with musical notes in sepia ink by an anonymous hand sometime in the late 18th or early 19th century. It had been her birthright and burden for these 2 decades since her father's death. Birthright because it constituted her father's most treasured bequest to his daughter. Burden because it never failed to remind Ottilie of how the last war stranded her in the world, alone with a child's memories of a man whose mad and maddening words on their last night together had turned her against the thing. Guard it as if it were your own child, he told her when she was still a child herself. One day this will bring you great fortune. I don't want it, she had said, remembering how bitterly her parents argued over the manuscript. Even years later, her mother considered what he had done an outrage, spending 3 months' wages to acquire it. Ottilie's father, like her husband, had always been an aficionado of antique things. But whereas Jakub knew what he was doing, her father, who worked so hard as a musician and instructor, and who loved his small collection of old hymnals and early printed music scores, was an easy mark for an unsavory dealer with a trunk full of fake illuminated medieval psalters and supposedly original drafts by a famous composer. When Ottilie's mother contracted tuberculosis, he sold off his precious scores for a fraction of what he'd spent on them to pay her medical expenses. The only jewel he kept from his hoard was this one, although he never told his dying wife that he'd hidden it in a corner of the attic, reachable only by a ladder she'd become too weak to climb. In melancholy moments over the years, Ottilie wondered if this manuscript with its haunted history ought to be destroyed. What reason did she have to believe it was any more authentic than the rest of her poor delusional father's stash? But sentiment and maybe faith always got the better of her. Besides, her father had personally inscribed it to her at the top of the first leaf in the language of his favorite composers. Engels Musik für meine Engelchen, alles liebe Papa. Angel music for my little angel, love Papa. And it still lay protected in its well-worn satchel. Though reluctantly, she too loved passages of the sonata, remembered how much her father used to adore playing it for her, or singing its sweet, sad melody to her as a bedtime lullaby. Once in a while, despite her resolutions, she caught herself humming one of its themes when walking along the river or nodding off to sleep. The fact was, she knew the manuscript was probably important. Jakub himself had done some research once she finally told him about its existence. He had shown it to a pianist friend named Tomasz, who expressed great excitement about the possibilities of its origins. This was several years into their marriage. One would have thought it a dirty secret, the way she had kept the sonata hidden from Jakub for so long. Puzzled but also curious about the manuscript's history, he tried probing Ottilie's girlhood remembrances. Where and how had her father obtained it? What was its provenance? After several outbursts, the likes of which he'd never seen from her, Jakub understood that the personal, emotional connection between the document and her father's death finally wasn't his business, so he never delved further into the matter. The artifact itself, however, fascinated, even obsessed him a little. Its fleur-de-lis within a crowned shield and the name H. Blum in the watermark, he told Ottilie, suggested that the paper might have been fabricated in Germany or Austria, but it wasn't a watermark he recognized. The brown ink, the stitching holes down the left side of the leaves that indicated it had once been bound, even the pagination in a dark russet crayon from a later period. The more he learned, the more everything about the object only underscored its authenticity. Questions preoccupied him. When was the sonata composed? Where? Was this a copyist's hand or the composer's own? Why had someone set down staves of hastily penned music in yet another hand on the unused paper at the end of the first movement, notes toward what appeared to be a completely different composition? And who had written these 3 enlightened movements? What an unforgettable evening it had been when Tomasz was finally allowed to perform the piece in his atelier in Mallestrana on an honest, of aging Bösendorfer grand piano, before an audience of a dozen acquaintances, including Otilier's best friend, Irina, who had long urged her to make peace with the manuscript and what it represented. Excuse me. 3 sonatas were performed that night on Sporkova, a short elbow of a street that curves from the bottom of Janska around to a square where the Lobkowitz Palace stands. The private concert began with the last of Joseph Haydn's piano works, Sonata No. 52 in E-flat major, followed by Beethoven's F minor, his audacious first, a work the younger composer dedicated to Haydn, who had been his teacher in Vienna. Both might well have been performed in their own time at the palace just down the way. After these came Otilier's nameless sonata. The mood in the room was uneasy, hopeful, doubtful. Otilier and Jakub's friends were excited by the chance to hear the mysterious manuscript played. And yet everyone wondered what would drive Tomáš to premiere this untried work in the wake of such obvious glories. It seemed somehow unfair to the unknown composer. He performed the first 2 compositions with real panache. Then, after the clapping ceased, he nodded to Jakub, who brought the manuscript to the piano. Tomáš began to play, his friend carefully turning the pages for him. What unfolded in the first movement was energetic and pleasing, if standard and rather Mozartian. The small audience nodded approval when this classic sonata form movement reached its satisfying final chord. What transpired in the second movement, however, was unexpected. Melodious descending scales concluded in lyrical eddies, pools of euphony that defied all laws of spiritual gravity when the waterfall of notes cascaded upward again. The music conveyed joyous esprit that mesmerized its unwary listeners. Then, abrupt as water hitting stone, its rich, poignant tapestries of sound ceased. What followed without foreshadowing, without warning, was a passage of unspeakable darkness. While Tomáš edged forward through this unsettling soundscape of purest dejection, Otilier found herself hearing the differences between his execution and the way her father used to play these very notes. As dark as Tomáš painted these musical phrases, her father's interpretation, which she related to her mother's death, was more tragic yet. Fighting back tears, she shifted in her seat through the third movement, a lovely traditional rondo that brought the sonata to its graceful conclusion. Silence hung in the parlor after the last note resounded and died away, but then the reaction was spontaneous and overwhelming. A collective gasp and a sudden burst of applause filled the room. Hobbled as the sonata had been by the fact that its performer was playing the work without benefit of much rehearsal, not to mention the unsympathetic acoustics, it was clear even to the most unmusical ear in attendance that here was something significant. "You absolutely must allow this to be studied and published," Tomáš exclaimed. But Otilier would have none of it. She refused to say why. Even Irina, who knew that the middle movement was deeply painful for her friend to hear, was unable to persuade her to listen to reason. As trays of wine and beer were brought around, Otilier Bartoshova thanked Tomáš for his memorable performance. Then, unnoticed, she carefully slid the manuscript back into its satchel, and there it had remained ever since. Thank you.
Well, that was lovely. I especially love the descriptions of the music itself. And I know I've told you this, that you describe the sonata in such emotional and sensory detail that I assume that you could hear it, that you can hear it. And I'm just curious.
That's a wild assumption.
Yes, I know. But what I'd even wilder, could you write down the notes? I mean,
Well, I know the notes. I mean, I know the key the movements are in, the keys the movements are in. So and I know the technical aspects of the sonatas. And I know from researching sonatas of the period what the first and the third movements actually would sound like. Mozart was who's the biggest rock star? Alex, who's the biggest rock star? He was the biggest rock star of the day. Oh, really? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
Better.
So Mozart was hugely influential, big rock star. Haydn never got to that level of fame, and Beethoven ultimately did. But there are Mozartian sonatas from the period and other lesser composers where what a rondo kind of sounds like. It depends upon what key it's in. It's the middle movement. That's the one I can really hear in my mind's ear. And the first and the third are movements that really anybody who knows the music of the period would kind of have a sense of what that sounds like. So I spend a great deal of my time in the book when I do describe what the music sounds like. That's on the second movement. But I couldn't write it. I mean, when you find out who the composer is, I wouldn't dare even try.
It works so well in the book, I think, because one of the really bad jokes that evolution has played on us is that we can imagine states of perfection that we can't actually achieve. So in reading through, you can hear it. But if you asked me to write it down, of course I couldn't. But I wondered what you were listening to while you were writing this.
Heavy metal. Well, that's true, actually. Heavy metal, jazz, classical music, a lot of Mozart and Beethoven and Haydn and the whole crew, late 18th century crew. The great masters. No Bach, though. I mean, I didn't want to hear Bach. But, Keith Jarrett. You
listened to a number of things.
Yeah, my musical tastes are very much like Meta Taverner's in the book. She is all over the map, and that's where I live, too. I mean, if you can live all over the map. I mean, my musical tastes are very, I wouldn't call them eclectic or eccentric. I would just call them omnivorous. I like folk music. Bring a banjo out, let's listen to that, hip hop. So yeah, I think the answer to that question is I didn't focus, and I think it's good that I didn't actually. I didn't focus on classical music as such, but there is heavy metal, in the book. Meta, at one point, is called Meta the Metalhead. She loves heavy metal. She loves rock and roll. She loves Jimi Hendrix. She loves Frank Zappa. And so it comes into the book. It's not just all classical. So that's, in terms of my playlist, believe me, it was very eccentric.
So you're not one of those writers who listens to one piece of music over and over and over while they're working?
Not anymore.
Uh-huh.
I used to. There are a couple of books. I did an interview, a back and forth with the novelist Richard Powers many years ago. And we talked about what we listened to while we were writing books. And I would get obsessed with, a piece by Ravel. And he would get obsessed with a piece by Bach. But these days, I like silence, actually, when I write. I mean, I really do. I can't. There's enough noise in my head as it is. And I really am afflicted by earworms. I don't know about you, but
yes.
Oh, my God. It doesn't have to be... what's that? Kids for cars for...
Don't go there.
They're even afflicted by that. I read somewhere that the kids are they're sick with that. The little guy with the guitar, he can't get it out of his... So, I mean, there are people like Rufus Wainwright, who I love, or even Joni Mitchell, I'm sorry to say, where I can't listen to it because I'll be stuck with it for 3 weeks. And that's the truth.
Yeah, I was asking because, as you know, a lot of writers have something that they obsessively listen to over and over and over. Yeah. And personally, I think that it must be some kind of emotional shortcut that allows them, me too, to go straight to where the book, like a bookmark, has been left.
Yeah. No, I really used to do that. There were, I'm trying to remember, certain pieces. There's a Ravel in particular, but now I just really need, even the birds bother me. I mean, I don't want to hear birdsong. I used to I do love birdsong.
Well, actually, I have a related question.
Okay.
Yeah. The world is full of sound, some of which results in horror, and some in music. New York is a very noisy city. I live upstate. do you listen to different music when you're here, and do you listen to music differently when you're here, or do you find it all part of the same soundscape? The music, the noise, all of it.
Wow, that's a real interesting question. When I listen to music here, it's to probably get my blood pressure down. I listen to like Toots Thielman or something. I'll listen, Peter. I mean, I'll listen to something, mostly jazz when I'm down here. Mm-hmm. But I write upstate. Like you, you're upstate, and it's a very isolated old farmhouse, and really the crickets, the peepers in the spring, and the birds, which right now are very quiet, which I appreciate. That's the noise. And then up there I can play any kind of music and be comfortable. But down here in the city, the city it's a completely musical place on its own. Very different from Prague, by the way, because Prague actually, you don't hear the sirens every 5 minutes. You actually hear music from the clubs and from everywhere, everywhere you go in town. So yeah, down here I think I put on music to wall myself off from the soundscape of the city.
Mm-hmm. You introduced us to one of the characters. Let's talk about the other main character. At the center of the story is this 30-year-old musicologist, Meta Taverner, who leaves behind her life in New York and goes on a quest to reunite 3 parts of this manuscript. So could you talk a little bit about what drew you to her, or what inspired you to draw her in the way that you did? I noticed that there's one scene especially where I think she says, it's like a prayer 30 times. She is asking, charge my life with meaning.
Meta's just really, I'm such a fan of Meta Taverner. Meta's a little naive, she's a little stalled, she's a really brilliant musician whose concert piano career was cut short in an automobile accident where her hand was hurt. And so rather than giving up, she, with the help of a mentor named Paul Mandelbaum, she tries to make a shift that's a lot harder to make than you might think, and that's a shift from being a musician to being a musicologist. That's not an easy shift to make. I've made friends with quite a few musicologists, and I've known since I was a kid, way too many musicians, way too many, and some of them are among my very best friends. But it's a different science. It's a different world that they live in. And so Meta made this shift, and she's got a boyfriend, and she's got a life in New York. She's doing all right. It's her 30th birthday. It's turn of it's the new millennium. And this manuscript comes into her purview. And suddenly she is, I don't really think of her name as being like associated with metamorphosis. I had another idea in mind about meta, but she is transformed by this, and she really wants to make something of her life that's more than what she's got now. So she doesn't throw everything aside. She puts everything on hold with the idea that, well, if I go and fail, I'll come back, but I can't not pursue this because the manuscript is really riveting. I mean, the manuscript I really can see in my mind's eye. I mean, I've handled a lot of 18th-century manuscripts in Prague and so forth, with the white gloves that they make you put on. And so I really have a visceral sense of what Meta discovers in Queens. And so it's a holy, artifact for a musician. And the fact that the music is revolutionary, it's transformative, is sort of something that would be very hard to do in that period, also intrigues her. And so, yeah, when she sets out on her quest, I followed her very closely. I let her lead the way a lot of the times. I mean, when I would do things during my research, she would sometimes follow behind me, but then other times she'd be out ahead of me and I'd have to follow behind her. I became very close with Meta. Weird as that might sound.
No, it doesn't seem that way at all. So I understand that you wanted to be a classical pianist, and Meta was going to be a concert pianist. Is this just an accident that's related like that? Do you identify with her?
Yeah, very much so. I shifted out of classical piano, and we got really, really interested in jazz. And I played with some really good jazz players and some great rock players too. And I won't drop names, but I mean some people who were very serious. And I played in clubs, and well, Steve Getz Quintet was I was a guitarist for them, and there was the sax player in the quintet was a guy named Andrew. Is it Wolf? Who was a sax player for Earth, Wind and Fire? Wolfson. That's close, anyway. But Andrew was in the band, and he was the one guy who was like hard jazz. He was never going to sell it. All of us were like, he thought we were all going to. And then, of course, then he joined Earth, Wind and Fire, and then he did pretty well. But I stepped on my hand. It's hard to do that unless you're on a very steep ski slope.
You don't need to tell us what.
Yeah. And it was an ugly moment, and I realized after that, I thought, oh, okay, well, there went that career. But I wanted to be everything. I wanted to be a painter. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be this and that.
But you get to be all of those things as a novelist.
As a writer.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Diane. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
So everything I learned about music and so forth, is shored up and it's applicable to, that's one of the beauties of being a novelist, is that every single failure in life, a divorce, nasty stuff, whatever, it's all useful. It's all fertile material.
Yes, we're vultures.
In other words, nothing really goes wrong. It looks really bad, but it's all very useful.
Yeah, I was thinking that when I was reading the scene where she was asking to have her life charged with meaning, because we don't go through this. Anything that happens is going to lead in some way to the next work of art. And in a kind of reverse fatalism, at the end, whatever work you left required the life that you led.
Right on. Yep.
Yeah, but she is going through that and is waiting for something that will change her life, that will transform it, that will create bridges, in fact. And you use that leitmotif all the way through in different ways. I thought really wonderful ways.
Yeah, and as smart as she is and as accomplished as she absolutely is, and the book is a learning experience for her. I'm not going to call it a Bildungsroman or anything like that, because she's too old for that at 30. But it's a book about setting a really high goal and pursuing it and persisting until you get there. Mm-hmm. And in a way, that's a kind of a metaphor for the writing of this book, how this book was for me.
Wait, it's a metaphor?
Oh, Diane. It is a metaphor, yeah.
All right.
Well, metaphor is a really interesting word, but maybe for another day. It has to do with crossing over. Mm-hmm. And meta crosses over from one life into a new life that actually benefits all of us because of the discovery she makes.
Mm-hmm. So another bridge image.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she has this accident, and she has to give up her dream. Then she begins stitching together the pieces of this sonata. She knows that she's entered a new chapter in her life. You say, if her own 30 years constituted a first movement of a sonata, she sensed in her gut that she was right now living the opening notes of the second. So maybe you could tell us a little about the form of the sonata, and if you were following that form as you were composing the book.
Okay, so the book is in 3 parts, but I avoided at all costs trying to slavishly follow a sonata form. So to have done that, the first part would have been something that would have bored the life out of everybody, because it would have just been this, would have been something you could, and then the middle movement would have been really avant-garde, confusing, innovative, crazy, and then the third part would have been like a little rondo. It's like, oh, that's a terrible book. So no, I really avoided at all costs the idea of I'm going to make this into a classical sonata. But having said that, there are structures that are kind of underneath the surface of the book that make me very, very happy that involve, well, I'll tell you a story. Allison, can I do this? Can I talk about Frank Zappa? So so just for instance, there's all kinds of, you don't get this on a first reading necessarily, but there's all kinds of musical, like echoes and things. In the original version, and when Meta's birthday party, they're playing Frank Zappa's Brown Shoes Don't Make It, like really too loud, and the neighbor is like banging it, turn that down, and they refuse to turn it down. Well, we wanted to use Brown Shoes Don't Make It, Quit School, Why Fake It? But when Allison went to the Zappa estate to get permission, well, they wanted some crazy amount of money, and they wanted my royalties, and it was all nuts. And, well, can we just at least put the title in there? Well, that'll cost you a little less, but we still want your royalties. So it's like, the hell with that. So I just put Frank Zappa Insurrectionist Anthem or something. But the sad part is, at the end of the book, there's a man who's a nemesis to Meta in the book named Wittmann. And he's standing in the East Village. I'm not giving anything away. But in the snow, and he's very troubled. He feels sorry for her, but he's really actually feeling sorry for himself. And he looks down at his highly polished brown shoes that are covered with slush in the snow. And for me, that was like, oh man, I had to lose that. But there's all sorts of little stitching. I love embroidering stuff, and there are little details like that are a part of a sonata tradition.
And so the sonata form, the first, the second, the third movements, what are they supposed to do?
Oh, well, that's a very tricky question. Well, sonatas are not all in 3 movements. Some are in 4 movements, some are in 2 movements. And they often don't have anything obviously to do with each other. You can go from the first movement, it's in 1 key with 1 theme, and then you can go to a second movement that has maybe echoes and ideas, but completely different work. And then a third movement, like say if it's a rondo, then we're probably boring the hell out of everybody here, but a rondo has a theme, then it repeats, and another theme, and it goes like that. So sonatas are very, very exotic little animals. They're amazing. And I think they don't play on expectation. It's almost like a John Ashbery poem or something. Like when you're listening to a sonata, you got to just sit back and take the ride. When you've heard one for the first time, it's true. And sonatas are very much part of, I think, the present landscape of music. I mean, I was thinking about Nirvana. Cobain, he learned a lot from listening to Beethoven about the whole dynamics. It'd be something soft, and it's like bang, and then it'll be soft again. That what he did. It was a formula, and he picked that up whether he knew it or not, like out of the 18th century, late 18th century. So I'm not answering your question.
Okay, that's fine. That's totally fine. This novel took over a decade to complete, so I'm curious why you needed to pause and set it aside for a spell. I mean, you wrote other books in between.
Yeah, no, well, it's more than a decade. I hate to admit it. I started it about 20 years ago, and I wrote some, and then I wrote another book because I frankly didn't feel equal to the idea that I had. I just didn't feel equal to it. So I'd write, I don't know, what was it? Giovanni's Gift, and then I write Ariel's Crossing, and then I write some more in the book, and I'd hit a pause where I don't know enough about these characters, so I write another book. Not that the other books were easy to do either, but I just needed to grow into the idea that I had, and it was actually embarrassingly when I published The Forgers, which was my last book, and I was down at the Miami Book Festival, and I bumped into Edward Hirsch, who is the head of the Guggenheim Foundation, and I'd gotten a Guggenheim to do this book back in 2007, and Hirsch said, "Oh, Brad, you're down here for our book," and I said, "Oh, Ed, I promise you, next book, I promise." And when I came back from Miami with my tail between my legs, I thought, no more books, no stories, no nothing until I finish this book. And then I made myself equal to it finally. But I had to grow into it. It really took a while.
Interesting. So you just let like the board meeting of your psyche be working in the back. And
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The notebooks on this, I mean, there's so much material that just never made it into the book. I mean,
It's very tightly plotted all the way through. I told you earlier I was trying to, just for my own nefarious purposes, since I'm working on a novel, I was trying to see the seams, but I couldn't find them. It's so beautifully plotted, and it ends up being a musical mystery, really.
that plotting is very, very just intuitive. I don't make plots. I mean, I don't make I'll write about characters. I'll do like family trees and stuff like that. But in terms of plotting the book, I plotted one book. I have a notebook full of plots, and I look back and it's like I abandoned that plot immediately. There are some writers who plot their books and stick with it, and God bless them. I mean, it's seamless only because it's really intuitive.
And because you have a narrative cast of mind, I think. So that's really another question that I wanted to ask, again, for personal reasons. Do you think fiction writers are born? Do you think fiction writers have a different cast of mind from, say, a poet or a creative nonfiction writer?
Holy Moses.
Sorry.
Wow.
And, well, you've seen so many of them also.
I know,
Yeah.
it's true. Probably. Yeah, probably. I mean, I can just speak from my own experience. When I was working on my fourth novel, Giovanni's Gift, I wanted to make it a work of nonfiction based on what was going on at my aunt and uncle's ranch near Steamboat Springs, Colorado. And I got about 20, not much more than 20 pages. I was already doing things like, well, that creek, if it could just be a little bit wider, so that later getting across it would be sort of harder to do.
Yeah.
If I could throw some, and I realized about page 25, it's another novel. This is not going to write a work of nonfiction. So I do write nonfiction. I tell the truth in my nonfiction, but I really like the joy of invention. But that is also not to say that, when you get into a fictional world, there are real constraints and rules, and you're building your own mountain that you're climbing up, but that mountain has got to make sense, and you've got to get up it.
And this one required a lot of research, too, and you were
A
trying
lot.
to stay true
Yeah.
to the landscape of Prague,
Yes,
and
yeah.
also to the history of what was going on there.
But I know poets, and I've known them for years, and it is true that they have they visualize images maybe slightly differently, they voice things differently. I mean, it's very hard for a poet to write a novel, and I think vice versa. Some people do. There are some amazing examples of people who can do both.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's rare.
Yeah, I'm finding, I mean, you'd think that so many of the motor skills would be the same, that if you can do one successfully, you could probably do the other if you put in as much time. But it doesn't feel like that. I've known a number of fiction writers, and their minds have so many twists and turns per square inch. I'm thinking of people like Bill Gass, or my late husband, Paul West, or just in reading your novels, there is a kind of narrative spree that seems to be taking place all the time. Whereas if you asked me, would I like to just sit and describe this rug and have ideas about it for 300 pages? I'd say, oh yeah.
Oh, really? Well, you would research where it came from, where the designs are,
Yes, I would.
the leaf
Okay,
patterns.
sure.
And,
There would be people involved.
you would make that rug come very much alive. For me, the rug is, I could do that too, but it would have to be somehow, tapestried into a crisis of some sort.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so you have a passion for music and also for words. And of course they go together, and people do both. But they seem so very different. Words are self-contained stories and histories, and you can understand one word at a time. And in music, it's best to have the tones interacting with each other. It seems like a kind of different game.
I wonder. Yes,
I don't know.
for sure.
I have no
But
idea.
there is that wonderful Emerson line, every word was once a poem.
Right.
But then, you can take that a step further and say every poem was once a sound. Every word was once a sound. And, then the
But
word...
you can have, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
You can have, if you hear words from another language, they won't necessarily move you unless you understand them. But you can have an emotional response to music without having to learn it.
I don't know. I love hearing foreign languages. When I can't understand something, I just listen to the rhythms and the sounds, and I almost feel like I can understand. I'm sure I'm wrong, but when I'm plopped down into a foreign country and I'm hearing other people, I want to know what's being conveyed, but on the other hand, it's just delicious to hear that the human voice conveying information through these plosives and all the gutturals and all the racket we make when we speak to each other. We make a lot of noise talking to each other, and I love hearing it when I can't understand too.
Yeah, that's. There's obviously no right answer for a question like that. I was just curious about how your mind was working, and clearly everything is music to you. And for Meta, her life is seen through the prism of music too. She says that her lover is music to her at one point.
Yep.
Well,
I don't think I could live without music. Maybe I could live without novels. I wonder.
Oh, harsh.
Never mind. That's wrong. I tried it out. It didn't work. But I wouldn't want to live in a world without music. That's for sure. It's so meaningful to me. And, I have friends here tonight who are great musicians, and I spent a lot of time talking with them about music, and fellow music lovers. And it's just, to me, it's like one of the most joyous, it's religious to me,
And you've had so many different forms of music in your life. So bringing them together in this novel is especially exciting for you, right?
Absolutely. I love it that the book is done. I love it that it's pub day today.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank God.
All right.
And I can't say that every day writing this book was a great joy, because it was not.
But didn't Thomas Mann say that it was the hardest, he wrote because it was the hardest thing he could possibly do in life?
Yeah, well, Dr. Faustus,
Yeah.
wow. But yes, I know a lot more about music that's in this book, but I focused on enough that I know about music that I feel really good about the novel's approach to that whole stratospheric, incandescent, transcendent world that's called music.
Mm-hmm. I've been thinking recently that reading fiction is excellent medicine for us in our troubled, broken world today, because it forces us to experience radical acts of empathy. And that can only help understand the viewpoints that are different from ours. And I wonder what you think about how useful it might be, reading fiction.
Well,
and does it change us?
Yeah, yes, it does. It saves my life every day. It really does. All the arts do. One of the things this book is about, and it'll sound like a little bit of a phrase, but it's about saving art and culture in the face of tyranny and greed. And we're facing that, I'm sorry, but that shooting the other day, yesterday, whatever, those people were listening to music. They were there to hear music. And, that was an assault in so many ways, on so many aspects of art and culture, as well as just poor human beings who are just listening to music. So yeah, and we don't want to get into politics necessarily, but we're under siege. We all know that here. And so that's one of the things that this novel is about. And I think every day we have to treasure our music, treasure our literature, treasure poets, treasure paintings. I mean, these paintings get lost and they get rediscovered again, but I look what happened in Palmyra. I mean, it's just kind of amazing how fragile our arts and our cultures are. And it's a huge necessity to appreciate it, every day.
And how they transform us. I mean, I think that they transform us, the wiring in our brain, transform our evolution as a species. And at Cornell, I live in Ithaca, the head of the MFA program was called in to the dean and asked to justify why the humanities should exist at all. And I've heard that elsewhere in other writing programs around the country. And so I'm trying to come up with some good arguments, if they have to live in this kind of mercenary economy on campuses. What the arts do for us, how they change us, how they ennoble us. And
what was your response?
No, that is it, that they change us, in the case of literature, that they force us into experiences of understanding other ways of knowing the universe that we wouldn't have known before, and viewpoints that might be radically different from ours. It is a struggle these days, nonetheless, with what's happening politically, but still.
Wonder if we want to throw any questions out to the audience? Or?
Yeah. Do you guys have any questions?
There's the music of the city.
Yes, that's true.
Brad, I'm just interested in your talking about the whole process of research, because it's, while research can feed your imagination, there's a time when research and your imagination are at war, sort of like what was going on with that stream that you were, so your desire to get it exactly right may mean that you can't do something that seems right from the point of view of your muse. And I'm just wondering if you encountered that and how you deal with it.
Well, research is, Diane knows as much or more about this, as I do. But research is, that's a tricky slope too, because you can get swallowed up in the maw of research and, never get back to the writing table and look, because research is kind of a blast, actually. If it's something you're interested in, I mean, you want to keep going with it. It's just fantastic. And, I did that. I mean, I have many Borum and Pease notebooks filled with notes that never got into there. I have a friend of the audience tonight who came with me to Oklahoma to visit the Pragues of Oklahoma. We went on a Prague quest, so I'm not going to tell it much more than that. But the notebooks are. When I was driving, he was filling up the notebooks. I said, "Oh man, look at that! The soil there is black. The hills are rolling more." So you can get really lost in the weeds of research, and you know this. And so what you need a little time to let the silt or something settle, and what remains. One of the things about writing a novel, though, I find more and more is that there was a phrase in my first book by a very bad person named Peter Krieger. And he said, "Oh, it takes a lot of truth to tell a lie," but Krieger's got a point. Because if there's not a lot of truth in it, I don't believe that. It's just a lie. So in a way, fiction is not a lie. It's a lie that gets to the truth. And in terms of research and the book is, I was absolutely insistent that everything is right. All the factual material in the book is absolutely right. So in a way, the music, when I describe the music, if I don't have the technical stuff down exactly right, then when I go on my flights of description that really have they're about colors of music and acrobats teetering on a wire. Well, that won't make any sense. You need to actually go along a parallel course. So, yeah, research to me is it's wonderful to do, and then you have to know, like, okay, now do something with what you've learned. Diane is a master of researching. I mean, Zookeeper's wife, if you've ever read it, but and she knows so much about natural history and so forth. Her metaphors tend to, in all of her books, she'll wink and say, oh, by the way, this happens with this kind of animal or whatever, says this microbe. And it's just all because of research. You carry the kind of knowledge forward that interests you.
Except I don't even think of it as research. I think of it more as just paying attention. Yeah. I think that's most of what I do. And most of what you do and most of what artists do, really, is just pay attention very steeply.
Yeah, no, that's totally true.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you about Gothic.
Okay.
Well,
no
all right.
questions. Oh.
Well, while they're
there's one right there.
Yes, churning some. Oh, okay, good.
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but your description of the writing of the book, with breaks to write other books, Giovanni's Gift, etc., and always returning to it, seems to imply to me that this book was very much more important to you because you kept returning, and I'm wondering if that's A, an accurate assumption, and B, something you've done with other books.
Yeah, I couldn't leave this book alone, and it wouldn't leave me alone. Sometimes a student will ask, well, how do you find your voice? Well, the pat answer is your voice finds you. But sometimes a cliche is actually, meaningful. They become cliches for a good reason. So this book kept after me as much as I kept after it. And I don't think it shows in the actual book the amount of persistence involved here, but it's meta-like in a way. I mean, I had to persist just like she had to persist to get to where she gets in the book. So yeah, the book wouldn't leave me alone. I'm so I'm so happy that she and I found a partial end to our journey here with this thing. But yeah, all my books, even the last book, I wrote that rather quickly, The Forgers, but I had researched it my entire adult life, so it wasn't a matter of flying around, going to Prague. I knew rare books really well, and I knew about forgery. I never forged anything myself, but I know how it's done and all that. So that was one that I couldn't wait to get up in the morning and just write all day. Get up in the morning, write, get up and write. So, they're all kind of different. Each book has a different biography or autobiography of the book. I'm sure it's true of all the writers in the room. Every book has its own distinct, problems and its personality and joys and triumphs and despair and all that stuff. So, yeah.
What's the difference writing with a female main character or narrator as opposed to a male?
The first book I wrote with the female narrator was my second novel. And the reason I did that was because it was about a woman. And I didn't want to write it in third person omniscient because I was afraid that I would be slightly judgmental because she had issues. She had migrainous auras and all kinds of stuff. And so I thought, well, let's just write it in her voice. So it's the closest I can get into what she's living through. And I remember at the time asking friends foolish questions like, well, does a girl pee or does she piss? And it's like, Brad,
it's more like, what does a lady do?
It depends upon what woman you're talking about. Some of them piss, some of them pee. And, and I thought at that moment, it was whoever slapped me down on that, it was a great, great moment. I realized, the voices are quite similar, especially if it's a smart woman or an intelligent woman or a smart man or an intelligent man or like a man who, everybody's very different. But I don't find those voices ultimately, it's really what's the voices are conveying in terms of what they're approaching, in terms of the theme and what the crisis is, to bring that word back in again. So for me, it's unusual for me to have written as many books in a female voice as I have. I think it's 3 at least. It's 3. But I don't really think about it. What I need is to get as close to whatever person, I hate thinking of them as characters, but the person I'm interested in as I possibly can, just in terms of my own approach to what's going on. So I don't ask dumb questions like that anymore, because I already know the answer. It's like, whatever that individual, however she thinks, that's what the words are.
And do you have a sense of what is going to happen to them after the story ends?
Sometimes. Sometimes, yeah.
Actually, I'm just asking how close you get emotionally to them, and if really you end up becoming your books.
No, I don't become my books, thank God.
Because for me, mainly writing creative nonfiction, the voice is always mine. I am my books, they're just not all of me.
Right.
But a narrator, the first thing that I asked you was an unanswerable question, I don't mean right here, which was, who is the narrator in this book? It's not one of the characters, it's not you, who is it? Is it a fictive self, I asked, and is it like a place kicker in football?
This
that gets
is really
wheeled
a
out?
complicated technical question, actually. There's a writer like Richard Powers. He writes an omniscient third, where it is an omniscient third, where there is no hint of Richard Powers, although he's the man behind the curtain.
Uh-huh.
But in my books, when I'm narrating in a kind of a third person, I often do what's called close third person. So when you're near a character, you kind of move that way, and with another character, the third person. Still, this is really technical stuff, which may be very boring to everybody. This book, I didn't want to write at all in close third person if I could have. I just wanted there to be a flat narrative, and I wanted to be absolutely the story that was front and center. Although now the voice is a voice that I recognize as my own writing voice. So yeah, I wrote the book, and but I don't really. I wrote the book, but I'm in the other room. So don't worry about me.
I'm just curious. Yeah,
No,
I was asking because these
it's like I don't want to have myself anywhere near with the reader's experience of. I hope I kind of wrote myself out of it entirely. It's interesting. There are writers I admire, like Marquez. At one point in Love in the Time of Cholera, there's a moment where he names a town in I don't know, Colombia, we'll say. He said, "Oh, open paren, where my wife was born," close paren, and he moves on. Nuts. Angela Carter loved inserting herself in some of her stories. So she'll bring up somebody like in the Lizzie Borden story that she wrote that's so great, Fall River Axe Murders. And she'll bring up like the uncle. She said, he has nothing to do with this, write him out of the story. Well, like, why bring him up in the first place? So Carter is suggesting her presence in the story. And that particular story is like a defense attorney defending Lizzie Borden's, she did probably do the murders. And Carter is saying, I'm here. I'm actually Angie here, and this is what I think. In this particular book, I really didn't want to get in the way of the reader. I just wanted to really be but not, it doesn't have a cold surface. It's had a very warm, I think.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to see how different novelists, what kind of sleights of mind they have to get into or enjoy getting into in order to write them. You would not have a great time in my book group. There are a lot of, in Ithaca, the town consists entirely of therapists and artists. And, well, yes, there are a few massage people. That's about it. And whatever book we're reading, Frankenstein, the psychotherapists want to know what the real motives were. They deal with them as real people, real relationships, and they psychoanalyze them.
That's fair enough. I don't know. Everybody has their own approach to everything, so why not?
Yeah. So How about Twilight? A lot of your books begin with Twilight, and this one does too. There is somebody who is a child in bed. It's Odelia, and Twilight is falling again. And the whole novel has this kind of porous quality between the past and the present, which seep into each other in different places. And I'm just curious if you are aware that you're doing that, or...
I'd love to say that I am, but it's an interesting point you make, because the book ends in daylight.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, if you start a book at twilight, and you go through a lot of, then you have a long passage. William Gaddis wrote a book called Carpenter's Gothic. You brought up Gothic earlier. And that book counterintuitively begins at dusk. Well, same here. And then it ends with the sunrise, with everything having gone wrong that can go wrong. And then it's about to go do it a second time, go wrong again. And so really what Gaddis was doing is it's the dark night of the soul.
Mm-hmm.
The whole book. Yes, there's other days and months that occur in there, but really the whole thing is so in a way, if it, this is not unlike that, I suppose. But I can't say that again, it's intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
It's intuitive. When you bring it up, it's the first time I thought of it.
Well,
or you thought of it.
Well, I was thinking of it also with regard to the Gothic, because I guess you could argue that this isn't a particularly Gothic fiction, except that it is full of ghosts of different kinds. And as I say, the past and the present are very porous in it, and it's about good and evil, mm-hmm. and the twilight world that is between them somehow.
Yep. When I was correcting proofs, or the last pass on the manuscript, there were so many ghosts in there. I was pulling ghosts out right, left, and center. I was like, what are all these ghosts doing in this book?
They pursue you.
Yeah, I guess. The book was haunted by ghosts. See, there's still probably too many. I don't know. But no, this is not a Gothic book. I've written plenty of Gothic books. This is more of a quest novel. I suppose it's with a bit of romance involved, in the old sense. Yeah.
Now, do we have any other questions? Well, I want to thank you for writing it. I love all of your fiction, but I absolutely adored this for so many different reasons, but most of all because of the glorious writing in it, which is just full of so many sensory details and observations about the human condition and so on.
Thank you,
Thank
Diane.
you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.